Hi everybody, welcome to this week's video. I want to start by acknowledging the fantastic work that you're doing on the reading journals. I'm really enjoying reading your analyses of your chosen film selection of Romeo and Juliet. So I just want to say keep up the good work and I see you. In this particular video, I'm going to talk about Jaime Magaña's The Tragic Corrido of Romeo and Lupe, which is an adaptation of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, set in Texas's Rio Grande Valley. This particular adaptation takes up Romeo and Juliet's themes of love, identity, and justice, and resituates that in Texas along the US-Mexico border, using it to explore contemporary issues such as environmental rights, historical memory, labor rights, cultural identity, assimilation, and much, much more. Let's talk a little bit about the author. Jaime Magaña is a Chicano poet, teacher, and community director based in the city of Pharr, Texas. I had the opportunity to meet him in March this year at a conference, and I have to say I was so impressed by how nice, how approachable, and how incredibly inspiring he was. The story of how he came to write the tragic corrido of Romeo and Lupe is a tale in of itself. Pedro Garcia, the director of the Pharr Community Theater, held a competition for a play that would address environmental issues in Texas along the US-Mexico border. Jaime Magaña's play won the first prize and was directed by Pedro Garcia, in 2018 at the Pharr Community Theater. I also want to talk to you about the historical and cultural context of the tragic corrido of Romeo and Lupe. To understand Magaña's play, we need to think back to Anzaldua's definition of the borderlands as a space where the first world and the third world meet, collide, the jagged edges rubbing against each other. And the particular conditions of the borderlands, of course, is formed by colonization and structural violence. However, Anzaldúa also makes the point that the borderlands is a space of incredible creativity and resistance. And I believe that we can see this in the Tragic Corrido of Romeo and Lupe, not only represented in the characters and the themes and the plot of this particular play, but also embodied by the play as a whole. For a Chicano writer like Jaime Magaña to write and adapt one of the most iconic plays in the canon of Western literature constitutes an act of literary and creative resistance. In reading the play, we also need to think back and recall Catherine Vomero Santos's video presentation on the decolonial imaginary of Borderlands Shakespeare. In the video, Professor Vomero Santos defines the genre of Borderlands Shakespeare as constituted by contemporary writers and artists taking up Shakespeare's iconic plays and situating them along the US-Mexico border. This is a way for them to explore Chicanx and indigenous voices, storytelling, mythologies, rituals, and experiences. An important point that Professor Vomero Santos makes is that such adaptations play with our conventional notions of time, the idea that time moves in a linear fashion from past to present. Instead, in these sorts of adaptations, we find references to a multiple variety of historical periods and time periods, enfolding these temporal worlds to create a story rich and complex that speaks to so many levels of our experience. We can certainly see this in the tragic Corrido of Romeo and Lupe, and I'll give you three examples. The first is that this particular play is set in the Republic of Texas. The Republic of Texas is an actual historical period in Texas history, lasting from 1836 to 1846, right before it is annexed by the United States. Texas in the 19th century starts out as part of the Republic of Mexico. Mexico was part of the Spanish Empire until 1824, when it fights the War of Independence and establishes the First Republic of Mexico. If you've read American literature, you're no doubt aware of the concept of manifest destiny, the idea that European American settlers of the United States were divinely ordained, were destined by God to settle the North American continent until the western coast of California. The scene for creating the Republic of Texas is set when Anglo-American settlers move into Texas, by then still a part of the Republic of Mexico, and begin establishing relationships with the Mexican Tejano community living in the state of Texas. They work for Mexican haciendas and ranches, they intermarry among Mexican Tejano families, and again, they establish important relationships within that particular state. Eventually, the Tejano community and the Anglo American settlers decide to succeed from the Republic of Mexico and to establish Texas as an independent state, which they do so in 1836. However, in this process, the Anglo American settlers begin to edge out the Tejano community from power and control of resources. They increasingly gain control over the property and the land, and the Mexican Tejano community becomes relegated to the status of workers or laborers. The exception is, of course, the families who intermarry amongst the Anglo American settlers. This, of course, is important background for understanding the family context for Romeo Campbell. For the Mexican inhabitants of Texas were descended from indigenous stock rather than from European Spanish stock, and who were considered to be traditionally less in class terms and in terms of ethnicity, they found their status to be reduced even further. They lost the ability to travel across the Texas Mexico border and to visit their families and relatives living in Mexico. They were also reduced in terms of their economic role to mere agricultural peons working in the emerging agribusinesses in Texas. This, of course, is important context for understanding the background of Lupe's family. In 1846, the Anglo American settlers in the Republic of Texas decide for Texas to become a state within the United States of America. Mexico is incredibly unhappy about that, and Mexico and the United States fight a war, the Mexican-American War, which lasts from 1846 to 1848. Mexico loses the war, and the United States and Mexico sign a monumental treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in 1848. Now remember that the territorial dominion of the United States at this point until the treaty extended until the eastern border of Texas. The rest of the lands of the North American continent were politically a part of Mexico. After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, however, Mexico cedes those western lands of the North American continent to the United States. And so the US gains not only Texas, but also Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, California, and a few other states. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848 is what establishes the map of the United States that's familiar to us today. However, the Mexican inhabitants of these states became a sort of in-between population without clear rights and without political power. So while you read the play, think about the historical impact of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo upon the different social groups represented within the play, and think about how this particular legacy impacts the tensions that you see represented in that play. The second historical period that we find represented within Magaña's play is the Chicano civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s. The American Southwest is a food hub even until today. In the 20th century, had these huge agribusinesses that were growing food in the Southwest using the labor of the Mexican workers imported in the 1940s Bracero program, as well as the labor of the Mexican Americans who had been living in these lands since centuries. The working conditions of Mexicans and Mexican Americans was incredibly poor, with long hours, no oversight, very, very little pay, child labor, and no health care. In 1962, community activist Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta launched the United Farm Workers Union, a labor union that campaigned to improve the working conditions of Mexican and Mexican Americans. In his 1969 letter from Delano, Cesar Chavez wrote, "We are men and women who have suffered and endured much, and not only because of our abject poverty, but because we have been kept poor. The color of our skins, the languages of our cultural and native origins, the lack of formal education, the exclusion from the democratic process, the numbers of our slain in recent wars, all these burdens generation after generation have sought to demoralize us. We are not agricultural implements or rented slaves. We are men." The Chicano movement won many important reforms, improving the working conditions for agricultural laborers in the United States. But much work still remains to be done. To a degree, many of these conditions of very harsh working conditions still continue in the 21st century. This context is important for understanding many of the scenes of protest and demonstrations represented in Magaña's play. So when you read about characters like Ramon or Plácido or other characters within the Diaz family, think about the context of the Chicano movement of the 1960s and 1970s. What do you think Magaña is saying about the persistence of many of the issues that heroic civil rights leaders like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta fought for into the 21st century? The third historical period that's referenced by Magaña is the Aztec Empire. The Aztec Empire and civilization stretched historically from the American Southwest into Mexico. Even though the Aztec Empire was defeated by the Spanish colonizers, the continuing presence of Aztec lifeways, cultures, and myths continues amongst the Chicano community today. So, when you read the play, think about the references to Aztec culture and civilization. Starting from Ramon's rap in scene 1 until the end of the play, there are numerous references to Aztec myth, culture, and lifeways. The final thing that I'm going to explain is the corrido. The title of the play is The Tragic Corrido of Romeo and Lupe. So, what is a corrido? A corrido is a narrative ballad in Spanish that's important to Mexican cultural history and to its relationship to the United States. The origins of the corrido comes from the Spanish ballad or the romance, which was brought over by Spanish colonizers to Mexico in the 16th century. In Mexico, the romance evolved into the corrido and became the voice of the lower classes and of popular culture. The protagonist of the corrido is usually an underdog, a wronged woman, a revolutionary leader, a folk bandit, or even a narco-trafficker, up against a system, up against an adversary who's more powerful than that protagonist. Corridos speak to the cultural hybridity of the relationship between Mexico and the United States. You will find corridos, for instance, on important events in the United States, such as the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Today, the corrido has entered into the stream of popular music through international Latinx pop stars like Nathaniel Cano and Bad Bunny, whose 2019 collaboration Yo Soy El Diablo became a mega international hit. With that, happy reading, and until next time.